The most devastating act of strength is not raised in anger, it's not loud, it's not violent. It's the decision to say nothing when every part of you could explain, could fight, could seek justice. It's walking away without a final word, without a neat ending, without giving them what they crave the most, certainty, because people don't obsess over what's finished. They obsess over what's left unsaid. And when you withhold closure, not out of cruelty, but out of discipline, you create a silence so loud it echoes inside them for years. That's not revenge, that's power, and it's not the kind that rules others, it's the kind that frees you. The Stoics taught us to master ourselves before we ever think about mastering outcomes, to choose stillness over noise, restraint over reaction, and sometimes the truest act of self-respect is to leave quietly and let others wrestle with the weight of their own actions, without your explanation to comfort them. If this speaks to something deep within you, if you're ready to explore the kind of inner strength that doesn't shout, but changes everything, please subscribe. Each step toward clarity begins with choosing what you feed your mind. Let this be one of those choices. There's something deeply uncomfortable about an unfinished thought, about silence where there should have been an answer. The human mind, brilliant as it is, was not built for ambiguity. It spins, analyzes, and deconstructs, not for fun, but for survival. Uncertainty feels like danger. An unresolved situation feels like a threat. That's why closure becomes so powerful, not because it changes the past, but because it gives the mind a box to put the past inside, a place to tuck away the chaos and call it finished. But not everything deserves to be finished. Not every ending has to be clean. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is leave the page blank. Because in truth, no sentence, no apology, no justification would be enough to explain why something truly ended. And the more they demand an answer, the more they expose that it's not healing thereafter. It's control. They don't want to move on. They want to make sense of you. They want to reduce you to a single understandable reason they can repeat to themselves when the silence gets too loud. When you refuse to give them closure, something unusual happens. They don't walk away. They linger. They dig. They analyze your every word, every silence, every glance from the past. And in that digging, they bury themselves deeper. Because what they're looking for isn't buried in you, it's in them. That aching need for answers isn't about you. It's about the gap in their own self-understanding. It's about needing to be chosen, needing to be right, needing to be in control of the story. But you didn't write the ending for them. And that drives the mind into overdrive. Because the moment you walked away without explanation, they lost the ability to shape the narrative. And that's the kind of loss that doesn't scar the body, it scars the ego. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." And how often do people waste their time chasing ghosts? Not people, but the memory of people. Not closure, but the illusion of what closure would have felt like. They replay conversations. They dissect your silence like it's a puzzle they can solve. But silence isn't a puzzle. It's a wall, a quiet, unshakable boundary that says, "This is where my explanation ends. This is where your speculation begins." And if they keep circling that silence, they do so by choice. That's the harsh truth. No one is stuck in the past unless they choose to live there. You don't need to clarify your absence. You don't need to explain why you stopped answering, why you stopped showing up, why you took a step back. Because the moment you do, you invite them back into a conversation that no longer serves your peace. You offer them a place in your story they no longer deserve. When you withhold closure, it's not about punishing them. It's about protecting yourself, protecting your peace from people who wouldn't have understood it anyway. And maybe that's the part that stings the most, for them. that you didn't even think it was worth explaining, that you didn't need a scene, a speech, a breakdown. You just needed to be done. The mind hates that kind of ending, the kind with no climax, no confrontation, no resolution. It feels unfinished. But sometimes the most powerful closure is no closure at all, because it forces the mind to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. It forces growth. And growth never begins in peace. It begins in pain. It begins when you realize that not every question will be answered. Not every story will be understood. Not every connection will get a proper goodbye. And that's not weakness. That's reality. Some people believe closure is a right, that if you've shared time with someone, love, friendship, effort, they deserve to know why it changed, why it ended. But that belief is rooted in ego, in the illusion that understanding brings peace. But it doesn't. Not always. Often understanding only opens more wounds. You tell them the truth and they twist it. You give them reasons and they debate them. You try to end things with dignity and they still call you cold. So why explain what they won't hear anyway? It takes strength to let silence speak, because silence will be misunderstood. It will be painted as cruelty, avoidance, arrogance. But none of those labels matter when you know your reasons are rooted in clarity, when your choice not to speak is anchored in peace, not pride. And if they don't understand that, that's not your burden to carry. That's theirs. People crave completion because they think it gives them permission to move on. But permission doesn't come from others. It comes from within. And if they haven't learned how to grant it to themselves, no explanation from you will ever be enough. The door to their peace doesn't open with your apology. It opens with their own acceptance. That's the difference between those who heal and those who stay stuck. The healed ones make peace with not knowing. The rest keep chasing ghosts and calling it closure. There's also a quieter kind of cruelty in constantly explaining yourself. It teaches people that your peace is negotiable, that every time they demand access to your mind, you'll open the door, that every time they feel unsettled, you'll come and settle them. But you're not responsible for making others comfortable in your absence. You're not the architect of their emotional recovery. And if they thought they were entitled to your reasoning, it only proves why they were never ready to hear it. When you choose to say nothing, you give them a gift they'll never recognize, the space to confront themselves. Because it's only in your silence that their thoughts echo loud enough to hear. You're not punishing them, you're revealing them. You're showing them what they do when no one is there to blame. You're giving them a mirror, not a microphone. The mind craves completion, but it doesn't need it. What it really needs is resilience, the ability to live with unanswered questions, to carry pain without needing to throw it back at someone. That's Stoicism, not the absence of emotion, but the control of it, not the suppression of truth, but the refusal to let truth be used as a weapon against your peace. When you withhold closure, you're not withholding kindness. You're simply refusing to participate in a story that's already over. A story that doesn't need another chapter, just because someone else wasn't ready to stop reading. And if they keep reading the silence, that's their journey. You've already written your final word. They just don't know it yet. When a story is unfinished, it doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade into the background. It lingers. It festers. It becomes a living presence in their mind, haunting the spaces you once filled. People pretend they've moved on, that it no longer affects them. But the truth is, the silence you left behind takes up more space than any word ever could. They start to replay the moments, twisting memories into new shapes, creating their own narrative just to soothe the discomfort of not knowing. And the irony is, the more they try to figure it out, the more the story wraps itself around them. They think they're letting go, but in reality, they're digging deeper into something that was never theirs to finish. This is the strange power of what you leave behind. Not the loud endings, not the grand explanations, but the space that makes them fill in the blanks themselves. When people don't have facts, they substitute them with feeling. They assign meaning to every detail you never gave them. And soon, you stop being a person and become a symbol of confusion, of rejection, of the moment they lost control of the story. They talk to themselves in your absence. They imagine what you might have said. They construct entire emotional timelines that never existed, all to satisfy the ache of incompletion. What they don't realize is that this isn't something you're doing to them. It's what their own mind is doing because you've stopped participating. You've removed your energy from their world. And that vacuum doesn't stay empty. It pulls at them. And nothing exposes the soul faster than silence. That's what an unfinished story becomes. A mirror. A reflection of their unmet expectations, their assumptions, their blind spots. They thought they understood you. They thought they knew how the story would play out. But you didn't follow the script they wrote in their head. You ended your role before they were ready, and now the rest of the play makes no sense. They stay stuck on a scene that already ended, hoping you'll come back on stage and deliver the lines they need to move forward. But that's not your responsibility. If someone has mishandled your trust, misused your presence, disrespected your energy, then walking away without closure isn't cruelty, it's consequence. They didn't protect the story when they had the chance. They didn't treat you like a character worth writing with care, so now they don't get a proper ending. That's the price of negligence. And while they spin in circles trying to rewrite the ending themselves, you're already living the next chapter. There's something profoundly human about wanting answers. The mind craves symmetry, neat conclusions, predictable timelines. But life doesn't work that way. Real growth rarely comes wrapped in explanation. It arrives in the discomfort of not knowing. It rises from the ashes of the things we can't define. And when you become the unfinished story in someone else's life, you also become the doorway to their greatest internal challenge: acceptance. Acceptance that not everything gets solved, that not every pain gets closure, that some things must be carried, not resolved. People don't get stuck because you walked away. They get stuck because they never thought you would. And that shock, that confusion, that rupture between what they expected and what happened, that's what chains them. That's what keeps them up at night, scrolling through old messages, looking for something they missed. But what they missed wasn't in your words. It was in their perception. They thought your presence was permanent. They thought you owed them an explanation. But presence is a gift. Loyalty is a gift. And if it's not protected, it's taken away. Quietly. Finally. The unfinished story becomes their obsession, not because they care more, but because they never learned to live without answers. They need your words to close the loop. But when you say nothing, you force them to face something deeper, their inability to let go. And that's the greatest leverage silence gives you. You're not holding power over them. You're showing them what they never mastered within themselves. And whether they resent you or revere you for it is irrelevant. The point is, your silence became their teacher, not in a gentle way, but in the way all real lessons are learned. Through discomfort. They may call it ghosting. They may call it avoidance. They may say you were heartless for leaving without a final word. But they'll never say you lied. They'll never say you manipulated. They'll never say you pretended to be someone you weren't, because you didn't play games. You walked away without theatrics, without noise, without letting them rewrite your story just to make themselves feel better. And that's the part they won't forget, that you exited with dignity, that you didn't scream, you didn't justify, you simply stopped. And now they're stuck with a half-finished sentence that they'll try to complete for years. That's not vengeance, it's distance. It's the cleanest boundary there is, not spoken, but felt. It tells them everything they need to know, that your time is not a revolving door, that your presence is not guaranteed, that your silence is not weakness. It's resolve. The reason unfinished stories live so long in someone's mind is because they're still trying to turn them into something comforting. But comfort was never your job. You're not the therapist. You're not the lesson planner. You were part of their story, and you chose to end your part when they stopped treating it with value. They can rewrite it however they want, but the truth will sit under all their words. They had you, and they didn't take care of what they had. And that's why silence hurts more than explanation, because explanation can be argued with. But silence? Silence is absolute. It doesn't change with their mood. It doesn't adapt to their guilt. It doesn't need to defend itself. It just is. It's final. And that finality is what makes the story echo. You didn't leave them broken. You left them responsible for the pieces. That's the part they don't say out loud. That in your absence, they had to face the parts of themselves that your presence helped them avoid. And in doing so, you gave them a choice, to grow or to stay stuck. And whatever they choose, it has nothing to do with you anymore. You've moved on, quietly, cleanly, unapologetically. And whether they ever understand your silence isn't the point. The point is, your story with them didn't need an ending. It needed to stop exactly where it did. Because sometimes the most powerful sentence is the one that never finishes, the one they read over and over again, hoping the words will change. But they won't. Because you already said everything you needed to say by saying nothing at all. Most people don't actually want the truth. They say they do, but what they're really asking for is relief. Something to take away the sting, the confusion, the raw edge of uncertainty. They ask for closure, not to grow, but to feel comfortable again, to make sense of something that may never be logical. They crave explanation because explanation feels like control. If you can label the pain, if you can name it, wrap it in language, it becomes easier to hold. It becomes something they can file away. But the truth rarely fits that neatly into words. It doesn't arrive in clean sentences or satisfying conclusions. It arrives as silence, as an ending that doesn't come with a speech. And that silence, that discomfort, is often more honest than any answer you could have given. We've been taught to equate closure with healing, that if we just talk it out, say the right words, revisit the right moments, we'll finally feel free. But freedom doesn't come from revisiting the wound. It comes from letting it be, letting it scar, letting it remind you of what you've outgrown without needing to understand every detail of how it broke. Explanation can soften the blow, sure, but it can also rewrite the pain in a way that makes it easier to avoid the lesson. When something ends, our instinct is to seek comfort first, not wisdom. We want the pain to make sense before we've even allowed it to change us. And that's where closure becomes an illusion. It promises clarity, but often delivers a diluted version of the truth. When you explain why you left, why you pulled back, why something changed, you risk offering a version of yourself that no longer exists, just so they can sleep better. But the version of you that walked away was already beyond the need to be understood. That version didn't need to justify its absence, it simply needed peace. And peace rarely asks for permission, it doesn't wait for applause or approval, it just leaves, quietly, firmly. And that's where your strength lies, not in how well you explain, but in how gracefully you let go without forcing the other person to feel okay about it. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny." And sometimes silence is part of that pattern, not because you chose it out of spite, but because explanation would have undone the very peace you worked so hard to earn. Silence becomes sacred when words would only be used to reshape the narrative in someone else's favor. When they want to hear your side, it's often not because they care, It's because they want to frame the story in a way that leaves them comfortable with themselves, with what happened, with who you became. But comfort is not your responsibility, especially when it comes at the cost of your clarity. There's something dangerous about giving people just enough of your truth for them to misinterpret it. They'll twist it, stretch it, replay it, and assign it meaning that fits their emotional needs, not yours. And then suddenly, your truth is no longer yours. It becomes a performance, a version of events designed to soothe their guilt or justify their part. But you didn't live that story to be understood. You lived it to grow. And not everyone is meant to understand what helped you evolve. Some lessons are personal, private, sacred. They don't require an audience or a closing statement. When people ask for closure, what they often mean is, "Tell me something that helps me avoid sitting in this discomfort." They're not asking for the truth. They're asking for a version of it they can manage emotionally. But the truth is rarely manageable when it's real. It doesn't tie up neatly. It doesn't care about emotional symmetry. It shows you things you didn't want to see about yourself, about others, about the fragility of connection. And when you try to turn that into a speech, into something digestible, you rob it of its depth. You strip it of the very thing that made it transformative. Pain was never meant to be explained away. It was meant to be endured so that it could shape you. And that's the thing about silence. It forces people to endure. It doesn't offer an escape route. It doesn't say, "Here's what went wrong." It says, "Sit with what you did. Sit with what you missed. Sit with what you'll never fully know." That sitting is uncomfortable, sometimes agonizing, but it's also honest. More honest than any line you could have fed them to soften the blow. And maybe in that discomfort, they'll finally begin to look inward, not outward. You don't owe anyone a final conversation just because they're uncomfortable with how things ended. If the relationship, friendship, or bond was truly valuable, they would have paid attention when it mattered, when you were still there, not after you became quiet, not after your energy shifted, not after you emotionally checked out. People notice absence far louder than they ever notice presence. But noticing too late doesn't grant them the right to demand closure, especially when they ignored the signs long before the silence arrived. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop explaining, to stop negotiating your peace in the language of those who didn't protect it. They'll call it cold, they'll call it inconsiderate, but what they're really saying is, "I'm not used to people walking away from me without needing to explain why." And that in itself is the clearest sign you made the right decision. You didn't leave to hurt them. You left because staying would have kept you trapped in a version of yourself that you'd already outgrown. You left because it was time. And that's a sentence that doesn't need punctuation. It just needs to be lived. So when they ask for closure, ask yourself, what would that even look like? What would you say that you haven't already expressed through your silence, your distance, your boundaries? Would they even hear it? Or would they only twist it to fit the narrative they need to believe? That you were the problem, that you overreacted, that you gave up too soon? Closure doesn't change that. It just gives them more material to shape a story where they're still the center. There is power in not explaining. There is power in not softening the truth for someone who never softened the experience for you. When you give no final word, you leave the story exactly where it hurt. Not to prolong their suffering, but to honor your own. Because sometimes, the only way to respect your journey is to let it end without offering a map for those who never walked beside you with presence. The pain isn't yours to resolve anymore. It's theirs to understand, if they ever choose to. And maybe they never will. Maybe they'll carry your silence as a grudge, a wound, a mystery. But they'll carry it, and in that carrying, in that wondering, in that silence that never turned into a speech, they'll be forced to grow or stay stuck. Either way, it's no longer your responsibility. You've already made peace, and if they still need an ending, they'll have to find it in themselves, because you're not writing one. You're already living the next chapter. There's a strange kind of peace people find when you finally speak. It doesn't matter if what you say is full of anger, sorrow, disappointment, or exhaustion. Once the words are out, they begin to lose their sharpness. The mind grabs hold of the explanation, starts to file it away, organize it, dilute it. That's what language does. It offers people a way to make sense of pain, a structure to hold what was once chaotic. And the more you explain, the more manageable you become. Even your hardest truths can be softened in time. They'll cry, they'll argue, they'll process, but eventually they'll understand. And once they understand, they'll let go. That's what words do. They release people. They set them free from the not knowing. But silence? Silence does something else entirely. Silence is not passive. It's not empty. It's charged. When you withhold words, when you choose not to answer, not to explain, not to narrate your pain, you leave behind a space that can't be easily filled. You create something open-ended, unfinished, and that unsettles people far more than any honest confrontation, because silence gives them nothing to hold on to, nothing to blame, nothing to build a narrative around. It gives them a mirror instead of a script, and mirrors are harder to escape. They show people the questions they've avoided, the blind spots they didn't know existed, the discomfort they thought they could outrun with closure. Most people think silence is avoidance, but it's not. True silence is restraint. It's what happens when you finally realize that your words are not medicine for everyone's confusion, that not every wound needs to be dissected, that some truths lose their meaning the moment they're spoken out loud. When you speak, you give them clarity. When you stay silent, you give them weight. And that weight settles differently. It settles in the mind, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between distractions. It doesn't hit all at once. It drips, it echoes, it evolves. And in that evolution, you become unforgettable, not because you were loud, but because you were unresolved. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But that kind of self-acceptance often doesn't begin until someone is forced to sit in the silence you left behind." That's the thing about reflection. It doesn't begin when you answer someone's questions. It begins when you stop answering at all. When they stop hearing your voice, they start hearing their own. And that's often what they fear the most. Not the loss of your presence, but the confrontation with their own thoughts in your absence. Silence makes them face themselves. Your words could have distracted them, could have pointed fingers, could have softened the blow. But silence turns the spotlight inward. And maybe that's why some people beg for closure. Not because they want to know your truth, but because they want to avoid their own. Your voice would give them something external to focus on, something to analyze, something to blame. But your silence gives them nothing. Just the sound of their own choices playing back without interruption. That's not cruelty, that's consequence. That's what happens when you decide that your peace no longer requires performance. You can speak and be completely misunderstood. You can explain yourself 100 different ways and still have your words twisted to fit someone else's version of events. But silence can't be misquoted. It can't be rewritten. It leaves no room for argument, and that's what makes it so powerful. It's definitive without being defensive. It draws a line without ever saying where it is. And that ambiguity, that quiet defiance, that's what makes people obsess. Because the mind doesn't like what it can't define. It wants a villain, a motive, a clear story. And when you give them none of it, they start creating it on their own. And in doing so, they reveal more about themselves than they ever did about you. Speaking gives them resolution. Even if they don't agree with you, even if they reject what you say, the conversation itself becomes a form of closure, a closing of the loop, a way to say, I understand now. And with that understanding, they move on. They categorize you, file the memory, and carry the version of you they need to carry to feel at peace. But when you don't speak, they don't get to categorize you. You don't fit into their neat little folders of right and wrong, good and bad. You become something else entirely, something undefined, something that lingers. And what lingers reshapes them. People don't realize how much power is in the space between words. We're so trained to fill every silence with justification, with reasoning, with comfort. But sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is say nothing at all. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much about not becoming small enough to explain away. Some things are too sacred to turn into conversations. Some endings are too complex to be flattened into closure. And when you honor that silence, you choose depth over resolution. You choose presence over performance. Eventually, they'll stop looking for answers in you, and they'll start looking for understanding in themselves. That's the turning point. That's where growth begins. When they realize your silence wasn't a punishment, it was an invitation to step into maturity, to ask harder questions, to listen more deeply, not to your voice, but to the part of themselves they've avoided. And if they accept that invitation, they change. If they don't, they stay stuck. But either way, your work is done. You didn't give them answers. You gave them space. You don't have to explain your distance. The people who truly valued your presence would have noticed the shift long before you went quiet. They would have asked what was wrong when it still mattered. They would have listened before you had to disappear. If they only seek understanding now, it's not because they miss you. It's because they miss the version of themselves they felt when they were near you. And that's not a reason to come back. That's not a reason to speak. They will tell themselves stories. They will guess. They will project. And those stories will keep you alive in their thoughts far longer than your words ever could. That's what silence does. It stays. Not because you wanted it to, but because they never learned how to live with questions. And in that struggle to find answers where there are none, they slowly become someone different. Sometimes stronger, sometimes bitter, sometimes wiser, but always changed. The urge to speak is strong, especially when you know you could make them understand. But ask yourself, at what cost? Do you want them to understand you, or do you want them to learn? Because the two aren't always the same. Understanding satisfies their curiosity. Silence fuels their transformation. One is about their comfort. The other is about their growth. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is let someone grow in the silence you leave behind. When you speak, you release them. You give them closure. You untie the knot. But when you stay silent, you become the knot. You become the question they carry, the memory they revisit, the lesson they don't yet have the words for. And in a world addicted to resolution, that might just be the most powerful thing you ever give someone. Not the answer, but the absence. Not the map, but the mystery. Because what they do with that space will tell you everything you ever needed to know. And by then, you won't need to speak at all. There's a quiet kind of wound that lingers long after everything seems fine on the surface. You don't see it. You can't trace its edges. You just feel it. And because it has no clear beginning, no clear reason, and no clean end, it becomes nearly impossible to move past. It follows you into new conversations, into new relationships, into the silence between thoughts. It's the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with sharpness or drama. It just lingers in the background like static. That's what happens when something ends without closure. It doesn't become a memory. It becomes a question. And questions that don't get answered tend to echo. We heal faster when we understand what hurt us, when we can point to the cause, analyze it, assign it a name. Anger, betrayal, abandonment. These words give the wound definition. And once something has definition, it becomes something we can manage. But when you leave without an explanation, without a reason, without that final piece of clarity, it creates something else entirely. A wound that doesn't bleed, but also never scabs over. A kind of psychic bruise that keeps getting pressed every time something similar happens. It turns into an ache that outlasts logic, because it's no longer about what happened, it's about what was never understood. People don't realize how much they rely on names to process their pain. A breakup is easier to mourn when it's labeled toxic. A betrayal is easier to accept when we call it dishonesty. But what happens when the person who walked away didn't curse you, didn't hurt you in a way that fits inside a word, didn't even tell you why? That's when you're left with the wound without a name. And that's what makes it dangerous. You can't fight what you can't describe. You can't confront a ghost. So instead of healing, you loop, you overthink, you question your worth. Not because they did something horrific, but because they did something quiet, left you wondering. Carl Jung once warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And maybe that's why the silence of someone who never gave you closure hurts so deeply. It's not just about them, it's about you. It forces you to examine parts of yourself you weren't ready to meet. Your attachment to being chosen, your fear of not being good enough, your tendency to search for external validation just to prove to yourself that you're worthy. When someone leaves without telling you why, they don't just exit your life. They open a door to your inner world, a door you've probably kept shut for a long time, and walking through that door takes courage. Most people turn back. They blame the silence. They hate the person who left, because it's easier than admitting that something inside them still needs answers they were never meant to receive. You can sit across from someone who hurt you and listen to every reason they give and still feel empty, still feel unseen, still walk away with more questions than answers. That's the illusion of naming the wound. Even when you know what caused it, it doesn't always make the pain go away. It just makes it easier to package. But when you don't get that package, when all you're left with is fragments, silence, and the echoes of something that used to feel whole, that's when the healing takes longer. Not because you're weaker, but because you're carrying something that doesn't have a container, something shapeless. That's what silence does. It strips the event of context. And without context, the pain becomes boundless. That's why people obsess. That's why they can't let go. Because if they don't understand why it ended, they convince themselves it's because they weren't enough, that something was broken in them, that maybe if they had said something different, done something different, been more of this or less of that, things would have turned out better. It becomes personal, even when it wasn't. And that's the part that lingers, not the person, but the shame. Without closure, they rewrite the story in 1,000 different ways. One day they blame you, the next day they blame themselves, and in that back and forth, they stay stuck because they're trying to name something that was never fully revealed. They're trying to pin down something that was never given shape, and so they chase it. Through conversations, through memories, through hypothetical scenarios that play out in their head at 2 a.m. What they don't realize is that they're not chasing the person. They're chasing the outline of an answer, a shape that never formed. That's why silence is powerful. Not because it hurts more, but because it requires more strength, more reflection, more maturity. Anyone can rage. Anyone can demand answers. But very few people are willing to sit with what they don't understand. Fewer still are willing to heal without a full explanation. That's what makes closure feel like a privilege. It's not just a moment of understanding, it's a shortcut, and not everyone gets one. Some of the deepest transformations come from the wounds we couldn't name, because those are the ones that force us to look deeper, to ask better questions, to let go of needing everything to make sense. They teach us how to walk with pain that doesn't have a clear source, how to hold space for uncertainty, and eventually, how to find peace in ambiguity. That's the part no one tells you, that the wound doesn't have to go away for you to be okay. You just have to stop needing it to explain itself. It's tempting to give someone closure just to relieve them, just to ease the tension. But you have to ask yourself, at what cost? If naming the wound means shrinking the truth or offering a version of events that simplifies the complexity of your experience, then maybe silence is kinder. Maybe silence is more respectful. Not to them, but to yourself. Because your peace shouldn't come at the price of distorting your reality for someone else's comfort. They'll try to name it anyway. People will always try to define what they don't understand. They'll label you distant, cold, avoidant. They'll say you were afraid to talk, that you didn't care enough to explain. But none of those names will fit, because the truth is, what you withheld wasn't love. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't truth. It was the closure they thought they deserved, but never earned. And what they felt wasn't abandonment. It was consequence, the result of not being present enough to deserve your final words. Eventually, they might stop trying to name the wound altogether. Not because they found the answer, but because they found themselves. That's the only kind of healing that matters. The kind that doesn't come from someone else's mouth. The kind that isn't wrapped in explanation or softened by apology. But the kind that rises from the silence, from the ache, from the space left behind. The kind that doesn't require a title to be real, and when they look back on it, maybe years later, they might not remember what you said, because you didn't say anything, but they'll remember what you didn't say. They'll remember the absence, the unanswered questions, the space you left behind that they had to grow into. That wound, the one they couldn't name, might be the one that changed them the most, not because it hurt the deepest, but because it asked the most of them. It asked them to face their own soul, and in doing so, it became the wound that didn't fade, but transformed. There's a point where words stop helping and start becoming noise. When someone pushes you far enough, when trust breaks, when betrayal replaces understanding, the instinct is often to speak, to shout, to explain, to unload everything you carried in silence. But what if silence wasn't avoidance? What if it was power? There's a strength in not giving people what they expect. Not because you're trying to hurt them, but because you finally understand that not every pain needs to be voiced to be real. Not every wrong deserves your reaction. Silence, in the Stoic tradition, is not a lack of feeling. It's the presence of discipline, the willingness to hold back even when every part of you wants to be heard. To stay quiet in the face of betrayal, disrespect, or provocation is not weakness. It's one of the hardest things you can do, because it requires you to master yourself in a moment where your emotions are pulling you in every direction. Speaking can feel like taking control, but often it's just another way of trying to be understood by someone who's already proven they don't care to listen. And that's where silence becomes your liberation. When you finally realize that your peace is not something you need to hand over just because someone else is uncomfortable with not being explained to. And silence, real silence, is a form of bravery. It says, I will not lower myself into chaos just to make you feel better about what you broke. I will not explain my absence, my distance, or my boundaries, simply because you didn't think I'd ever enforce them. That kind of restraint isn't cold, it's clarity, the kind that comes when you've seen enough, said enough, and finally know that nothing more needs to be added. Not for them, for you. People often mistake your silence as indifference. They'll say you shut down, that you don't care, that you're emotionally unavailable. But what they fail to understand is that silence can be the loudest answer of all, not the kind that begs to be understood, but the kind that says with absolute finality that you're done participating in the noise. Because you've come to understand something vital. Your peace is not a negotiation. It's not something you place on the table every time someone demands access to your energy. It's yours, and protecting it doesn't make you cruel, it makes you wise. Discipline isn't about denying emotion, it's about channeling it with purpose. And silence, when chosen intentionally, is a form of emotional discipline. You've seen what happens when people overshare, when they bleed out their truth to someone who isn't ready to hold it. It doesn't heal anything, it just leaves you empty, vulnerable, often misunderstood. That's why silence is sacred. It's not hiding, it's honoring. Honoring your truth by not offering it to places that didn't respect it when they had the chance. There's something incredibly powerful about saying nothing and letting your absence speak, about refusing to turn your pain into a performance, about stepping back without dragging anyone into a final, dramatic scene. The world is noisy. People are always talking, always defending, always justifying, but very few people have the courage to be still, to say, "You'll figure it out on your own," and then let them. Without follow-up, without correction, without trying to shape the narrative in your favor. That's strength. That's ownership of self. Control isn't about managing what others do. It's about mastering how you respond. And in some cases, the strongest response is no response. Not because you're running from conflict, but because the moment no longer deserves your presence. Because the chapter has closed, and you don't need to underline the final sentence for it to matter. The lesson has already been written, and if they missed it, no amount of explanation will help them find it. Carl Jung once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." And that's exactly why silence is discipline. You're not suppressing what you feel. You're just not weaponizing it. You're not turning your pain into ammunition. You're holding it, sitting with it, letting it sharpen your awareness instead of your words. That kind of internal work doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need validation. It just needs space. And sometimes silence is the only way to create that space. You do not owe every wound your explanation. You don't need to bleed in front of the person who cut you just so they understand the damage they caused. You're not responsible for educating someone who never took the time to understand your value when you were right in front of them. Letting them feel the consequence of your absence is not cruelty. It's clarity. It's the moment you decide that your energy is no longer available for repair because it's already been redirected toward your own healing. Not every ending needs a speech. Not every goodbye needs to be verbalized. Sometimes leaving quietly is the most honest thing you can do, because it shows you've finally stopped trying to make things right for everyone else. You're not leaving to make a point. You're leaving because staying would be a betrayal of yourself. And the moment you realize that, your silence transforms from something passive into something sacred. A line drawn not in anger, but in wisdom. You owe your peace to no one. Not the person who hurt you, not the people who want you to soften the truth, not even your past self who still longs to be understood. You don't owe your energy to anyone who didn't honor it when it was freely given. And when you choose silence, you're not shutting people out. You're choosing to be with yourself, with your thoughts, with your integrity, with the version of you that finally understands that peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the absence of needing to explain who you are just to be left alone. There's dignity in restraint, a quiet power in not reacting. It's not a void, it's a statement, one that says, I am no longer available for chaos disguised as conversation, and that's not bitterness, that's self-respect. People who misunderstand your silence were never listening to begin with. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them build their version of the story. Meanwhile, you protect what matters, not your reputation, but your inner world. Because when you master the discipline of silence, you begin to hear yourself more clearly than you ever heard anyone else. And that's where your real power lives, quiet, steady, unshaken, just like you. What cuts the deepest isn't always the departure, it's the silence that follows. It's not knowing why someone left, why something changed, why the closeness vanished without explanation. That gap between what you thought you knew and what actually happened becomes a space filled with doubt, with questions that grow louder in the quiet. And that's why people chase closure so desperately. It's not always about understanding. Often it's about escaping the ache of uncertainty, that heavy confusion that clings to everything after. They think if they can just get a reason, the pain will shrink. If they can hear a sentence that explains it all, the restlessness will go away. But pain doesn't vanish with answers. It transforms, and not always in the way people expect. When you offer an explanation, you often give them an escape. You rescue them from having to sit with what they've avoided. The discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of reflection, but confusion, if you let it sit long enough, becomes a mirror. It forces people to look at things they never wanted to face, how they showed up, what they ignored, how they contributed, what they didn't ask when they had the chance. That's what they're really trying to run from, not your absence, but their own reflection in it. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and that's the truth most people don't want to hear. Awareness isn't born from comfort, it's born from discomfort, deep, unrelenting discomfort. The kind that keeps you awake not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. And that's what silence becomes, not a punishment, not cruelty, but a threshold, a moment that divides who they were before they lost you from who they'll have to become to understand why. The urge to know why is human. It gives people a sense of control. It helps them feel like the ending was logical, explainable, manageable. But life rarely offers that kind of neatness. Some things fall apart not because of one clear reason, but because of 100 quiet ones. Things left unsaid, ignored, dismissed. And sometimes no answer would satisfy the ache they're feeling, because what they want isn't truth, it's relief. Relief from the guilt, the confusion, the realization that maybe, just maybe, they played a role in what broke. And if you give them that relief, you take away the very pressure that could have forced them to evolve. You remove the weight that could have shaped them. It's not about holding power over them. It's about trusting that their growth is more important than their comfort, that awakening them matters more than soothing them, and that sometimes the greatest act of love, for them and for yourself, is to let them wrestle with the silence you left behind. People say they want honesty, but often they just want reassurance. They want you to tell them that it wasn't their fault, that you were just going through something, that it had nothing to do with what they did or didn't do. But that kind of honesty isn't honesty at all. It's performance, a carefully constructed exit to protect their self-image. And the moment you participate in that, you deny them the chance to confront the truth on their own. You give them peace, but at the cost of growth. There's a quiet power in not explaining, not because you want them to suffer, but because you respect the process too much to interfere. You understand that real insight doesn't come from someone handing you answers. It comes from asking better questions. And those questions don't arise when someone explains everything for you. They come when you're left to sit in silence long enough to start asking yourself, what does this say about me? What does this reveal that I haven't wanted to see? When you walk away without giving reasons, you invite them into a deeper confrontation, not with you, but with themselves. And while they may resent you for it in the beginning, what they find in that process may eventually become the very foundation of their growth. You don't have to be there to witness it. In fact, your absence is often what makes it possible, because as long as you're still explaining, they're still looking to you to make sense of themselves. But that journey was never yours to complete. This is where the misunderstanding often happens. People assume that silence means indifference, that not giving closure means you don't care. But sometimes, silence is the most caring thing you can do, because it honors the truth that you can't carry their emotional development for them. You can't lead someone into awareness by hand. All you can do is give them the space to find their own way through the confusion, and that means resisting the urge to make everything make sense. We live in a culture obsessed with clarity, with final words, with "I need to know." But knowing isn't always healing. Sometimes it's a distraction, a way to delay the real work. Because clarity without accountability just becomes another excuse. Oh, that's why they left. Now I can stop thinking about it. But the point isn't to stop thinking. It's to start thinking deeper, to stop blaming and start examining. And silence is the one space where that shift can begin. When someone loses you without explanation, they're forced to trace the steps backward. Not just your steps, but theirs. They look at the conversations, the tension, the things that felt off, but were ignored. And that's where the real questions come alive. Not why did they leave, but why didn't I notice they were already halfway gone? Not why didn't they say more, but why didn't I ask while they were still here? And those questions, painful as they are, open the door to change. There's no need to be cruel, no need to disappear as a game, but there is a need to protect your energy from being wasted in places that aren't ready to grow. Explaining yourself to someone who only hears what protects their ego is a kind of spiritual self-abandonment. You give your energy to a wall and call it closure. But closure that only serves their comfort isn't closure. It's avoidance wrapped in politeness. There is something deeply human about wanting to be understood, about wanting the last conversation to end with a sense of mutual clarity. But not everyone can meet you there. Not everyone wants to see clearly. Some people only want you to say what keeps their story intact. And when you realize that, you also realize that silence isn't abandonment. It's the moment you step back and let life become their teacher. It's the trust you place in their ability to eventually face the lesson without your narration. You don't need to be the one who wakes them up. You just need to stop being the one who protects them from waking up. Your absence, your silence, your refusal to explain is not a wall. It's a mirror, and mirrors don't change people. They just show people what's already there. Whether they run from it or grow from it is their journey, but you gave them the opportunity, and that's more than enough. Sometimes, the most profound thing you can do is leave the door open and walk away without saying why. Not because you're careless, but because you finally care enough about yourself to stop begging to be understood. And you care enough about them to let their confusion become their turning point. Not everyone will thank you, but the ones who do, years later after the storm, will tell you that the silence did what no speech ever could. It woke them up, and in doing so, it changed everything. Obsession rarely comes from love. It comes from uncertainty, from questions that never got answered, from conversations that ended mid-sentence and moments that were never fully understood. People don't keep thinking about you because they care more than they should. They keep thinking about you because their minds never closed the loop. Something was left unfinished, and the human mind, by nature, cannot tolerate loose ends. It spins, it replays, it analyzes, not to find peace, but to solve what feels unsolvable. The absence of closure isn't just silence, it becomes a riddle, and the longer it remains unanswered, the more they become consumed by it. Not because you're the center of their heart, but because you're the center of their confusion. That's the difference most people don't see. Obsession doesn't need your presence. It feeds off your absence. It thrives in that space where logic ends and imagination begins. When people don't know what happened, when they don't know why you walked away, why you never came back, why you left things hanging, they fill in the blanks themselves. They create stories, scenarios, conversations you never had. They interpret silences that were never meant to mean anything, and over time, those stories become louder than the truth ever was, because the truth is gone, and imagination is all they have left. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what obsession does. It turns your absence into a living presence inside someone's unconscious mind. They think they're moved on, but every time they hear your name, every time they see something that reminds them of you, every time the quiet becomes a little too loud, they're pulled back in. Not because you asked them to stay, but because you left without giving them a way to leave. Closure is the door people walk through to exit the emotional room. When that door is missing, they keep circling the walls, looking for it. That's not manipulation, that's memory. And memory, especially when unresolved, becomes a prison. Not a scar. Scars fade, but a thread. One that's tangled and frayed and impossible to cut because it's woven into everything. Into how they love, into what they fear, into how they trust again. And every time they try to untangle it, to make sense of it, they pull tighter. They tighten the knot. Because they're trying to force clarity where there was only silence. They want your absence to say something it was never meant to say. There's something haunting about someone who never gave you an ending. You can't hate them fully. You can't love them fully. You can't forget them fully. They exist in a strange middle space in your mind, suspended between what was and what could have been. And that space becomes sacred. Not because it holds truth, but because it holds possibility. That's the most addictive part of confusion. It lets people imagine their own version of you. The version they needed. The version they wanted. The version they thought you were becoming before you disappeared. And the more time passes, the more that version of you evolves. Not based on reality, but based on their emotional need to complete the narrative. They'll say, "I just want to understand." But what they really want is for the story to make sense in a way that doesn't hurt. And if you won't give them that, they'll build it themselves. And that building becomes obsession. It becomes the thing they think about when they're alone, the thing they bring into new relationships, the thing they compare everything to. But you're not really there. It's not you they're clinging to. It's the unanswered question, the emotional cliffhanger, the door that never closed. And as long as that door stays open in their mind, they never leave the room. They might move cities, they might fall in love again, they might laugh, succeed, even forget you for days at a time. But every once in a while, something pulls them back. A song, a phrase, a familiar look in someone's eyes, and suddenly they're there again. Back in that emotional loop, wondering, remembering, trying to solve a question that no longer belongs to them. You don't have to be cruel to create this effect. You don't have to ghost them maliciously or disappear without compassion. Sometimes, even when you say everything you can, people still walk away with questions because they weren't ready to hear your truth, or they weren't paying attention when you were showing them everything without words. Obsession isn't always about what you did. It's often about what they missed, what they overlooked, what they failed to grasp until it was already gone. And that kind of regret leaves marks, not visible ones, but the kind that turns silence into obsession. There's a reason why some people are remembered more for how they left than how they loved. Because exits, especially unresolved ones, carry weight. They echo, they linger. And if someone doesn't understand why you're gone, they'll hold on to the last moment with a grip that doesn't loosen. Not out of love, but out of the need for resolution. They want to file it away, to name it, to place it somewhere safe so it stops interrupting their life. But without your help, they can't. And that's when your absence becomes their obsession. Not because you did something wrong, but because they never found the thread to pull the knot apart. It's not about being unforgettable. It's about being unresolved. That's the emotional trigger. That's what keeps them circling. They're not remembering you because you were perfect. They're remembering you because you were a question they never got to answer. And some people live their whole lives haunted by one question, not because it's profound, but because it's personal. It speaks to the part of them that still doesn't feel enough. That still wonders what they did wrong. That still believes if they could just go back and say the right thing, everything would be different. But you know better now. You know that your silence isn't a game. It's a reflection of the boundary you finally honored, of the truth you no longer need to explain. You know that letting someone sit in the discomfort of confusion is not manipulation. It's the honest result of a story that didn't need more words. And if they keep chasing the thread, trying to untangle what you left behind, that's their journey. You've already let go, and that's the difference. Obsession is a prison made of questions. And questions, when left unanswered, become bars. But you didn't build the prison. You just stopped giving keys to people who kept locking themselves in. You walked out the front door and chose peace over clarity, stillness over closure. And in doing so, you gave them the one thing they couldn't handle, an ending that made them question themselves more than they questioned you. And maybe, one day, that will be the beginning of their healing. But until then, they'll carry you not as a person, but as a thought that never quiets, a thread they keep trying to pull, a silence that never turns into a sentence. And in that space, you'll live, not loudly, but permanently, not because you wanted them to stay, but because they never figured out how to let go of the question you never answered. When someone says, "Just be honest," what they're really asking is, "Please set me free." But freedom isn't given by another person. It's not something you unlock for them with the right words, the right tone, or the perfect explanation. True freedom is earned, and not through closure, but through acceptance. Yet most people don't realize this. They're convinced that if you just tell them why, if you just give them one more conversation, one last reason, they'll finally be able to move on. What they don't understand is that your silence is not what's keeping them stuck. Their unwillingness to accept what is. That's the real prison. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is not respond at all. It sounds harsh to say. People want communication. They want clarity. But what they really want is to be relieved from the discomfort of confusion. They want to feel like the story ended on their terms, with a ribbon tied around it, so they can walk away feeling calm, justified, and in control. But life doesn't always offer that luxury. Some endings are jagged, some don't come with closure, and some never will, because closure isn't owed, especially when the other person has already stepped out of the room. At some point, the need to know becomes a form of control, not healing. A way to keep a connection alive, even if it's through questions and imagined conversations. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That quote carries weight here, because the moment someone expects you to give them peace through your words, they've placed their emotional freedom in your hands. And if you were to answer, to explain, to give them what they think they need. Maybe they would feel better for a moment, but it wouldn't last, because their healing isn't about you. It never was. It's about whether they can learn to accept something without needing to understand it completely, whether they can let go without having all the pieces lined up. Most can't. So they keep reaching for you, thinking you hold the key to their release, when in truth, they're the ones holding the lock shut. When you remain silent, people interpret it however their mind needs to. Some say you're cold, others say you're afraid, some think you're punishing them. But what you're actually doing is stepping back. You're respecting the boundary that needed to be drawn. You're letting them find their own strength instead of handing them another excuse to avoid facing themselves. That's the part they rarely acknowledge, that their obsession with closure isn't about what you did. It's about what they haven't accepted. And if you were to speak, if you were to offer that last explanation, you would only delay the one thing that truly matters, their own growth. People often confuse the silence of another with emotional captivity, as if your absence is something you're using to control them. But silence isn't a weapon unless they make it one. It's not your responsibility to manage how someone interprets your decision not to engage. You didn't promise to be their healer. You didn't agree to be their final therapist. And if they can't move on without you spelling things out, maybe that says more about their dependence than your decision. Sometimes we want to answer out of guilt. We see their pain, their confusion, their desperate attempts to make sense of it all, and we feel bad for being the reason. But feeling responsible for someone else's emotional clarity is a trap. It drags you back into dynamics you already had the courage to walk away from. And it never works. The more you explain, the more they ask. The more you give, the more they need. It never ends. Because they're not looking for truth. They're looking for control over a story that has already ended. But the only way to truly end it is to stop feeding it. There's a quiet kind of wisdom in letting someone wrestle with the silence, in choosing not to edit yourself into their version of closure. You become something they have to sit with, not a voice in their inbox, but an echo in their mind. An unresolved page they can no longer rewrite with your input. And in that space, they're left with only one option: to look inward, to ask themselves why they need so badly to hear from someone who is already gone, why they believe someone else's words can do for them what their own acceptance cannot. Sometimes people don't want closure. They want to feel like they mattered, like their presence impacted you, like they were important enough to deserve a final explanation, and maybe they were. But being important doesn't always mean being entitled. You can deeply value someone and still walk away without saying everything, because sometimes saying everything means saying too much, offering parts of yourself that were never seen, never appreciated, and wouldn't be understood even if you screamed them. Silence isn't cruelty. It's clarity wrapped in self-protection. It's the decision to stop handing your peace to people who might drop it again. When someone asks for honesty, remember, they might not want the truth. They might want a version of it that makes them feel better, a version that flatters them. That makes them the wounded one, the victim, the person left behind by someone too emotionally distant to communicate. But if your silence is rooted in truth, then you've already been honest. You've said what needed to be said, even if it was with your absence. That doesn't make you heartless. That makes you disciplined. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free," and freedom, in this sense, is the bravery to walk away without tying up every loose end. To accept that not every thread has to be sewn, that not every story needs a moral. Some just end, abruptly, quietly, and the people left behind are the ones who have to make peace with the silence, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about your own sanity to stop explaining what was never truly heard in the first place. The need for closure is a very human one, but it's also a trap when misunderstood. It keeps people cycling back to moments that already ended, to people who already left, to feelings that are no longer reciprocated. And the longer they stay there, the further they drift from the truth, that their freedom isn't in your mouth, it's in their hands. It always was. You can love someone deeply and still recognize that silence is the only thing left to give, because anything else would become fuel for more questions, more expectations, more attachments. And sometimes, loving someone means letting them figure it out without you, letting them sit in the discomfort of their own thoughts, not because you don't care, but because you do. Enough to stop playing a role in a story that needs to end. Eventually, they might stop asking, not because they got what they wanted, but because they realized they were never going to. And in that realization, something important happens. The questions quiet. The obsession fades. The need to be freed by you transforms into a decision to free themselves. And that moment is real closure. The kind that sticks. The kind that doesn't come from your voice but from their own. Until then, let them say what they need to say. Let them misinterpret the silence. Let them craft their stories. You're not responsible for how they cope. You're only responsible for how you heal. And healing sometimes means resisting the urge to explain what's already done. To let go not just in action, but in energy, in thought, in presence. They want closure to free themselves from you. But they don't realize that true freedom was never yours to give. And you don't owe it to them, not in words, not in conversations, not in carefully wrapped explanations. Sometimes the most honest answer is no answer at all. And that isn't the absence of love, it's the beginning of self-respect. There's a kind of silence that echoes longer than any shouted goodbye. Not because it's loud, but because it leaves space. Space for the mind to wander, to create, to imagine what it can't confirm. When you walk away without finishing the story, you don't erase your presence. You multiply it. You give them fragments, not closure. And those fragments turn into questions. Those questions turn into memories. And those memories? They turn into stories they tell themselves late at night, trying to piece together something that no longer belongs to them. But that's the thing about an unfinished story. It doesn't die. It loops, quietly, endlessly. And every version they invent will feel incomplete, because deep down, they'll always know they weren't meant to write the ending. Letting someone rewrite you is not a loss, it's a mirror. It reflects their own needs, their projections, their inability to sit with what actually happened. And they will write. They'll write entire narratives around your silence. They'll tell themselves who you were, why you disappeared, what it meant, what it didn't mean. And with every version, they'll drift further from the truth and deeper into the echo of you. That's not something you control. And it's not something you're responsible for either. Because once you're gone, truly gone, the story belongs to them. But the story they write will never touch the weight of the truth you held and refused to hand over. That refusal, that's what stays with them. There's something unsettling about not knowing how something truly ended, about losing someone without hearing their final thoughts. People think closure is about healing, but often it's about comfort. They want the reassurance that what happened was explainable, containable, forgivable. But when you don't finish the story, they're left to wonder. And wondering is far more enduring than knowing. The mind clings to ambiguity. It fixates on the unanswered. That's how people become haunted, not by trauma, but by possibilities, not by pain, but by questions. Carl Jung once said, "What you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate. And when you don't let them bring your ending into the light, when you walk away before they're ready, They carry you as a fate instead of a fact. You're not a chapter they closed. You're a shadow that stretches over every new connection, every unspoken fear. They compare others to you. They measure new beginnings by the weight of your silence. Not because you were perfect, but because you were never fully understood. And that's the thing. People don't obsess over what they comprehend. They obsess over what doesn't make sense, what ends without a headline, what leaves them asking themselves, "Did I miss something?" They'll replay every interaction, dissect every silence, remember every time you paused before you spoke. They'll search for meaning in moments that had none. Because without an ending, even the smallest memory feels loaded. And the worst part? They won't trust any of their own conclusions. Because deep down, they'll always know they never got the truth from you. But that's not cruelty. That's consequence. The cost of being inattentive when it mattered, of failing to ask when you were still open, of waiting to understand when you were already gone. And so you don't finish the story for them, you let them fill in the blanks. Not because you're unkind, but because you finally realize that peace isn't something you have to trade for someone else's clarity. Your silence is your closure. Your departure is your final sentence. And if they still feel like there's more to say, that's not your weight to carry. There's a strange kind of dignity in leaving without wrapping everything up, in choosing not to explain yourself into a version they can handle. People want you to shrink for them, to make your absence small enough that they can store it neatly in a box labeled, "I understand." But some departures aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be felt, to ripple quietly across years, across relationships, across nights spent wondering what could have been different, not because you want them to suffer, but because your presence was never disposable, and if they treated it like it was, your silence becomes the consequence they'll live with. The temptation to explain, to finish the conversation, to say, "Here's why," it's always there. Especially if you still care. Especially if part of you wants to be seen accurately. But that temptation is a trap. Because the moment you offer them closure, they're free. Not in a good way, in a way that lets them forget, that lets them walk away convinced that they understood you. And sometimes that's more painful than being misunderstood, because people who think they understood you will never revisit their mistakes. They'll never grow from the absence. They'll never carry you as a lesson. They'll just move on, untouched, unshaken. And that's not what this was for. When you let them write their own ending, they keep you alive in ways you never intended. You become the story they revisit when things fall apart. The question they measure other people against. You become the person they almost figured out, but didn't. And that mystery, that lingering question, it becomes a thread that weaves through every chapter of their life. A silent teacher, a sharp reminder, a presence they never quite release. Because unfinished stories don't fade, they ferment. And over time, they realize something, that no matter how many versions they write, none of them give them peace. Because peace doesn't come from completing the narrative. It comes from accepting that some stories aren't meant to end the way we want them to, that some people don't say goodbye, that some connections don't resolve. And until they learn to accept the silence, they'll be rewriting you forever. Plato once said, "We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light." And in this context, the light is truth. But not your truth, their own. The truth they've been avoiding by chasing you, by needing your words, your reasons, your final chapter. But you don't owe it to them to drag them into the light. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave the page unfinished. Let them sit with the darkness of not knowing. Let them find their own light. You gave what you could. You showed up while it mattered. And when it stopped mattering to them, you left. Not with a bang, not with drama, but with enough restraint to preserve your dignity, That is not something to apologize for. That is something to be proud of, because not everyone has the strength to leave a story half-written and walk away knowing that the silence will echo louder than any explanation ever could. So let them wonder. Let them remember you in fragments. Let them try to finish a story they were never ready to understand. That's not on you. You've already turned the page. Let them catch up, or don't. Either way, you're free. And they're left holding the pen with nothing but questions and the memory of someone who never gave them an ending, because they didn't deserve one. When you give someone an explanation, what you're really handing them is an exit, a rope, a ladder, a map out of the discomfort that they themselves created. You tell them why, and suddenly they have something to hold on to, a reason to soothe their ego, a sentence they can repeat in their heads until the pain dulls. And maybe that seems kind, maybe that looks like compassion, but often it's just another way of sparing them from sitting in the shadow of their own choices. It's a way of rescuing them from the very lesson they needed most. People think they want truth, but what they usually want is relief. They want a narrative they can live with, something clean, something they can explain to their friends, something that makes them feel like it wasn't really their fault. And when you offer that to them, when you give them your reasons, your heartbreak, your pain, you're not helping them grow. You're helping them escape. Escape the consequence of their behavior. Escape the accountability that silence would have forced them to face. You become their closure, their savior, their emotional cleanup crew, and all they have to do is listen. But silence? Silence is a different kind of reckoning. It doesn't give them a script to recite. It doesn't offer them the comfort of knowing exactly where it all went wrong. It leaves them in the maze. And in that maze, they start to realize something. That the questions they're asking aren't just about you. They're about them. Why they didn't see the signs, why they ignored the warnings, why they treated you like you were permanent when you were already walking away. That's the weight of silence. It forces reflection, not because it's cruel, but because it doesn't offer shortcuts. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That's what silence does. It irritates. It gets under the skin. It lingers. And in that lingering, it opens a door. A door not to your truth, but to theirs. Because the absence you leave behind doesn't stay empty. It becomes a mirror. A mirror that shows them the parts of themselves they were too busy avoiding while they were busy trying to explain you. When you choose not to explain, you're not punishing them. You're holding a boundary, a line that says, "This is not my burden anymore." Because every time you explain, you enter their world again. You crawl back into their mind, their story, their emotional framework. You allow them to pull you into their logic, their pain, their chaos. And for what? So they can finally sleep at night. So they can walk away without the weight of wondering. Maybe. But maybe that wondering is exactly what they need. Letting someone stay in confusion is not the same as abandoning them. It's allowing the natural weight of consequence to take its shape. Not everything needs to be softened. Not every ending needs to be made easier. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone is to let them sit with what they've done. Let them feel the sharp edges of what they lost. Let them wake up in the middle of the night realizing they don't get another chance to make sense of it. Because that's how real transformation happens, not through explanation, but through silence that speaks louder than words ever could. We live in a world obsessed with closure. Every book, every movie, every relationship is supposed to end with clarity, with clean lines, with mutual understanding. But life rarely works that way. And the more we chase those endings, the more we rob ourselves of growth. Because not knowing, sitting in the discomfort of ambiguity, is one of the few things that actually makes us pause and re-evaluate. It forces us to stop blaming others. It pushes us to ask better questions. It humbles us. When you walk away without a speech, without a breakdown, without a final chapter, you leave a space that can't be filled with excuses. They can't say, "Oh, they left because of this." They can't simplify it into a neat little box. They're stuck with the whole story, unfiltered, unwrapped. And that kind of story lingers. It echoes, because it was never about what you said. It was about what they failed to see while you were still around. People underestimate the power of absence. They think distance means freedom. But emotional absence, when left unexplained, is one of the most powerful forces in the human psyche. It creates obsession, not out of manipulation, but out of mystery. We are wired to seek resolution, to fill in the blanks. And when there are too many blanks, we start to replay, to overanalyze, to obsess. And in doing so, we carry the presence of the person who left with us into every room we walk into. Not because they haunt us, but because they were never fully understood. You may think that offering an explanation will help you move on, that if you just tell them the truth, you'll be free. But the truth is, you're not responsible for how they carry your absence. You're not responsible for how they choose to interpret the silence. Your job is to protect your peace, to hold your boundaries, to honor the part of you that doesn't want to be dragged back into a story that already ended. And if your silence hurts them, then maybe it's the first time they've felt the weight of something real. Let them feel it. Let them sit in the questions. Let them remember you, not through the clarity of your words, but through the presence of your restraint. That's not cold. That's disciplined. That's not punishment. That's power. The kind of power that doesn't need to be proven. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that speaks through absence more than any carefully constructed goodbye ever could. So when the urge comes, when you want to send the message, write the explanation, tie up the loose ends, pause. Ask yourself who it's really for. Is it for them, or is it for the part of you that still wants to be understood? Because the truth is, the people who truly valued you never needed an explanation to begin with. And the ones who didn't won't learn from it anyway. Your silence is not a weapon, it's a filter. It separates those who were ready to grow from those who just wanted to be pacified. And when you choose to stay quiet, you don't just walk away, you rise. You become the echo that lives in the back of their mind, the voice they hear when they try to justify their choices, the face they see when they realize they mistook presence for permanence. You don't have to tie the knot for them. Let them hold the rope. Let them feel the tension. Let them realize that not every wound gets a bandage. Some wounds exist to be felt, to be remembered, to be learned from. And if your silence becomes that lesson, then maybe, just maybe, it was the most honest thing you ever gave them. Some people chase peace like it's a trophy, as if every story needs a graceful ending, every wound a soothing balm, every fallout a final bow where both sides walk away feeling validated. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is not offer peace. Because not all closure is healing, some of it is just an illusion that helps people avoid accountability. That's the hard truth many don't want to hear. And sometimes, refusing to play along with the performance of peace is the most honest choice you'll ever make. We've been told that peace is the highest goal, that maturity means keeping everything calm, composed, and emotionally tidy. But peace at what cost? Your self-respect, your clarity, your growth. Sometimes peace is just another word for repression, a quiet cover draped over chaos to make it look acceptable. And when you choose silence instead of forced reconciliation, you disrupt that illusion. You leave them with the tension they tried to avoid. You let them sit in the imbalance, and in that discomfort, something real can begin to grow. Because not everything is meant to be resolved. Not every relationship deserves a handshake at the end. Some endings are meant to stay jagged, to sting, to remind you and them that something real happened here, something that can't be undone with a few kind words or a polite conversation. And if you're constantly seeking to smooth every wrinkle, you rob yourself of the edge that sharpens you. You turn every scar into a story of compromise instead of letting it be a symbol of your boundary, your refusal to tolerate what once hurt you. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that becoming often requires friction. It requires moments where you choose integrity over harmony, where you choose silence not because you're cold, but because you're clear. Clear that not everyone deserves access to your peace. That peace, real peace, isn't about how quiet things are on the outside. It's about how steady you remain on the inside, even if the world around you doesn't get it. You see, there's a kind of silence that doesn't just protect, it reveals. It shows people who they are without your commentary. It removes the cushion of your validation, your explanations, your soothing. And when they're left without that comfort, they're forced to confront themselves. That's where the lesson lives. Not in what you say, but in what you withhold. Because your silence carries more weight than any carefully chosen words ever could. It's a space they have to fill with their own reflection. And for many, that's far more powerful than closure. When you choose silence, you're not withholding peace out of spite. You're honoring the imbalance for what it is. You're saying, this didn't deserve a pretty ending. You're letting the pain be felt in its raw form. Because sometimes pain is the only thing strong enough to break through the noise. Sometimes it's the only language people truly understand. And in a world where so many speak just to be heard, silence becomes a sacred kind of defiance. There's a tendency to rush toward emotional neatness, to wrap everything up with a bow and call it forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't always mean conversation. Sometimes it means walking away with your head high and your mouth closed. It means knowing you don't owe them understanding just because they finally want it. Because if peace is only offered after your silence, maybe it's not peace they're seeking. Maybe it's relief from guilt, from confusion, from themselves. And yet this isn't about being unkind. It's about recognizing that not all connections are meant to be repaired. Some are meant to break you open, to teach you what you no longer accept, to expose the cracks in your own foundation so you can rebuild. That's why silence is so hard. It doesn't give you the illusion of closure. It gives you the reality of what's left behind. It shows you what still hurts, what still echoes, what still needs healing. And that awareness, that's where real transformation begins. Seneca once wrote, "Fire tests gold, suffering tests brave men." Peace doesn't test anyone. Discomfort does, and silence is a form of discomfort that many try to escape. But if you can sit in it, if you can let it stretch and sting without rushing to fix it, you become stronger, not harder, not colder, but wiser, more rooted in yourself, less desperate to explain your choices, less eager to be understood by those who never cared to listen in the first place. This isn't about withholding to punish. It's about preserving what's sacred, your growth, your boundaries, your energy. Because every time you speak, just to make someone else feel better about what they did, you water yourself down. You dilute the depth of what was real. And over time, that constant explaining erodes your sense of self. You start to wonder if your silence was too much, when in fact, it was the only thing you had left to protect your dignity. So no, peace isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's lonely, even if it means being misunderstood. Because peace that comes at the cost of your voice, your clarity, your values, isn't peace at all. It's just avoidance dressed up as grace. Let them think what they want. Let them fill in the blanks. Let them wrestle with the silence. Because what they think of you isn't your business anymore. Your business is healing. Your business is growth. Your business is learning how to walk away without needing to rewrite the ending. And in doing that, you become someone who doesn't just chase peace. You become someone who creates it from within, even when the outside world remains chaotic. You'll be tempted, of course, to send that last message, to clear the air, to explain that you're not heartless, just tired. But pause. Ask yourself what it would really change. Would it bring you peace, or would it just bring them comfort? Would it help you grow, or would it just pull you back into a dynamic that you've already outgrown? There's nothing cruel about silence. There's nothing cold about walking away without words. Sometimes it's the most compassionate thing you can do, for them and for yourself. It gives everyone space to feel what they need to feel, to ask themselves the questions they were too afraid to ask, to sit with the sting of what was left unsaid. And through that sting, maybe, just maybe, they'll find something real. Because in the end, not every chapter ends with applause. Some end with silence. And that silence, that's the sound of you choosing something better than balance, something deeper than comfort. That's the sound of you choosing yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let yourself be misunderstood, because the moment people understand you, they place you in a box. They define your limits, shape your motives, and strip away the depth of who you really are. But when they can't quite figure you out, when your silence leaves them wondering, when your actions don't match their expectations, something strange happens. You become unforgettable, not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't explain. Because what can't be named can't be tamed. Being misunderstood hurts at first. It feels like rejection, like a personal failure, like you owe them clarity. But what if you don't? What if not being understood is your shield, not your flaw? What if it's the very thing that protects your soul from being dissected, interpreted, and reshaped by people who never really cared to know the real you? There's a quiet power in ambiguity, in not handing over the blueprint to your emotions, in keeping a part of yourself reserved, guarded, untouched by the noise. You don't have to justify the way you love, the way you heal, the way you withdraw when things become too loud. People who demand full access to your insides are rarely interested in your truth. They're looking for a version of you they can manage. And if you make yourself too easy to understand, too predictable, too open, you give them the tools to dismiss you, to minimize your depth, to reduce you to something they can walk away from without feeling the weight of what they lost. But when they don't understand you, you stay with them, not as a story neatly closed, but as a question left open. A presence they can't quite resolve, a feeling that keeps echoing even after you've gone. And that feeling, that's power, that's presence, that's how you live rent-free in the spaces they thought they could tidy up and move on from. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But here's the twist: when someone can't understand you, when your silence irritates them, when your distance unsettles them, it's not you they're confronting. It's their own reflection in the absence you've left behind. You're not confusing, you're a mirror, and mirrors don't need to speak. The human mind craves closure. It wants stories to have clear beginnings, middle points, and endings. But you're not a story. You're a process, a paradox. You're becoming. And people who rush to define you interrupt that process. They think naming something means knowing it. But understanding isn't ownership. And your complexity isn't a puzzle they get to solve. It's a landscape they can only wander through, if you let them. And sometimes you don't. There's a silent strength in walking away without a final word, in choosing not to correct the narrative they've written in their heads. Let them write it. Let them get it wrong, because that error they carry is its own kind of justice, and in time it will weigh more than your words ever could. When you don't chase being understood, you conserve your energy for what truly matters, becoming who you were meant to be, not who they assumed you were. The more someone knows about you, the easier it is for them to distort it, to retell it, to weaponize it when they feel wounded. But if they never fully understood you in the first place, they have nothing solid to throw back at you, only guesses, only theories, and every theory they form about you tells more about them than it does about you. When you give someone the gift of understanding, make sure they've earned it. Make sure they'll hold it with care, because being known is sacred, and not everyone is ready to carry the truth of your spirit without dropping it, without reshaping it into something more convenient, more comfortable, more familiar. Familiarity is not the goal. Truth is, and truth doesn't always need to be explained to be felt. Epictetus reminded us, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Sometimes being misunderstood is a consequence of growth, of choosing a path that others don't recognize yet, of choosing silence when chaos calls, of leaving when you've already given enough. It's not that you're unclear, it's that they're unwilling to meet you where your clarity resides, and that's not your burden to carry. Let them wonder why you stopped responding, why you walked away without explanation, why you didn't defend yourself. Let them sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because in that silence, something deeper than understanding begins to grow. A curiosity, a reverence, a realization that maybe, just maybe, they were never meant to figure you out. They were meant to feel your absence and reflect on what it meant. The need to be understood is deeply human, but the ability to let go of that need, that's divine. That's Stoic. That's how you rise above the noise and become untouchable, not because you're better, but because you're focused, because you've decided that your peace is more valuable than their approval, that your depth is not a gift for the ungrateful, that your silence is not emptiness, it's intentional space. There's a quiet rebellion in refusing to explain yourself, in choosing stillness when the world expects noise, in leaving questions unanswered, not out of cruelty, but out of discipline, because you don't need them to understand your boundaries to respect them. You don't need them to get your reasons to validate your choices. You need only to honor your path, even if no one else walks it with you. You will be called distant, cold, arrogant. You will be labeled with names that don't fit because people are scared of what they can't define. Let them speak. Their labels don't touch you. They echo in the space between who you are and who they imagine you to be. And in that space, you remain free, free from their stories, free from their need to reduce you. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you failed to communicate. It often means you refused to perform, that you held your truth in silence and let it speak without a script, that you allowed your presence to do the talking. And presence doesn't always come with subtitles. Sometimes it just lingers, quiet, intense, unresolved, and that's more powerful than anything they expected you to say. So stay unreadable, not because you're hiding, but because you've realized you don't need to be known to be powerful. You don't need to be explained to be felt, and you don't need to be understood to be free. Let the mystery remain. Let the silence echo. Let your absence say what words never could. Because in a world addicted to noise and explanation, your silence becomes sacred. It becomes legend. It becomes the reason they can't stop thinking about you. Not because you said something profound, but because you didn't say anything at all. Most people think that the end of a relationship, the final chapter, is written with words. A goodbye, a confession, a moment of closure, but those who've lived long enough and lost deeply enough know the truth. It's not the goodbye that echoes, it's the silence that lingers. Words can be rationalized, argued, replayed, even forgiven. Silence, though, it doesn't resolve. It doesn't explain. It doesn't hold your hand as you walk away. It just vanishes. And in that absence, something haunting is left behind. When someone says goodbye, there's at least a line drawn in the sand. There's a label slapped on the ending. Breakup, falling out, separation. Something concrete. Something that the mind can cling to, analyze, dissect. But silence leaves the pages blank. It leaves them staring into an unfinished sentence. A door that closed without sound. A final chapter they never got to read. And the mind doesn't know what to do with that. So it loops, it circles, it searches, and while they're searching for why, they find you. Again, not in the physical sense, but in the memory, in the questions, in the could-have-beens, in the 1,000 quiet moments they replay, trying to spot the sign they missed. You become not just someone they lost, but something unresolved. And unresolved things tend to grow inside the mind. They become larger than life, taking on weight they never had when you were actually there. It's easy to move on from someone who gave you an answer. It's harder to forget someone who disappeared mid-sentence, because in that stillness, you left them alone. Alone, not just with the absence of your presence, but with the reflection of their actions. Silence doesn't accuse, it reflects. It creates a mirror they can't escape, and in that mirror, they see not only what they lost, but why. And perhaps worse, how little they understood you at all. Seneca once said, "Light griefs are loquacious, but the great are dumb." That's the essence of it. Real grief doesn't always shout. It doesn't demand to be heard. It hums in the background of daily life, in quiet thoughts and what-if glances. Your silence becomes that hum, subtle, persistent, inescapable. It doesn't fade with time. It deepens, because every time they think they've let go, the silence whispers that they never held you completely in the first place. This kind of silence doesn't need to be cruel to be powerful. It doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from clarity. From knowing that the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is say nothing, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, because your energy doesn't need to be spent teaching someone the value of what they weren't ready to hold. And over time, something shifts. At first, they might resent the silence. They'll call it avoidance, immaturity, coldness. But that's just the ego protecting itself from the sting of being left without a script to follow. As time passes, the noise quiets, and what's left behind is the truth. That silence is not emptiness. It's full of everything that was left unsaid, everything that was misunderstood, and everything they now wish they could ask but no longer have access to. You see, goodbyes often come with answers. They're packaged in reasons, closure, final moments. But silence, it leaves them responsible for writing the ending themselves. And most people aren't ready for that kind of authorship. They want you to explain it to them, to validate their version, to tie it up neatly so they can place it in the past. But you don't owe them that, not if their presence didn't honor your truth when it mattered. Not if their understanding now is only a pursuit of comfort, not growth. When you give someone a proper goodbye, you release them. But when you leave them with silence, you give them something else entirely. You give them the space to confront their own role in your disappearance. And that's far more powerful than any spoken explanation. It's the difference between helping them move on and making them look inward. People underestimate how loud silence can be. They think if nothing is said, nothing is felt. But the human mind hates empty spaces. It will fill silence with meaning, memory, and often regret. And when that silence is intentional, when it comes not from weakness but from strength, it creates a different kind of impact. It becomes symbolic, a sign that something deeper was lost than just a relationship, a sense of understanding, a connection that can no longer be defined. So you don't need to slam doors. You don't need to send paragraphs or compose a perfect final message. You don't need to break it down or tie it up. You only need to step back and stay quiet. Let them notice the absence. Let them sit in it. Let them wonder, unravel, guess. Let the silence stretch far enough that they begin to realize they were never listening to you in the first place. They were listening to the version of you they created in their own minds. That version can't survive the silence, because silence strips away fantasy. It doesn't reinforce their illusions. It disrupts them, and that disruption is the beginning of truth. A truth they might never admit out loud, but one they will feel every time your name crosses their thoughts. Goodbyes may offer peace, but silence offers transformation. It invites reflection, discomfort, even guilt, and not for vengeance, but for growth, for the possibility that maybe next time they'll listen more closely, value more deeply, choose more wisely, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll move through life haunted by something they never understood but never forgot. And that's okay too. You were never responsible for their understanding. You were only responsible for your integrity, for preserving your peace, for honoring your truth even when it didn't fit their narrative. That's what silence does. It protects your spirit from being dissected, debated, and diluted. It says, I don't need to be remembered clearly, I just need to be remembered honestly. And sometimes honesty only speaks when the noise stops. So when you feel tempted to explain, pause. When you want to say one last thing, breathe. When they demand clarity, give them space instead. Because if they truly valued what they lost, they'll feel it in the silence. And if they didn't, no explanation would have ever changed that. In the end, what stays with people isn't what you said. It's what they felt and never got to resolve. The confusion, the ache, the questions, that's what lingers. And sometimes that's what teaches. You don't need to deliver a lesson. You only need to leave room for one. And silence does that best, without a word, without a sound, without needing to be understood to make an impact. They will forget your goodbye, but they will remember the silence. Because silence doesn't tell them the story, it makes them live in it. And that's what stays, long after the moment has passed, long after you're gone. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say nothing at all, not because you're cold, not because you're heartless, but because silence can carry more truth than words ever will. A Stoic doesn't react for applause. They don't perform for closure. They don't explain themselves just to be understood. And in a world that constantly demands explanations, where every exit must come with a reason, a justification, a detailed emotional report, the Stoic path is to walk away without burning energy on what no longer aligns with the truth. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much about preserving peace over pleasing confusion. People often confuse silence with cruelty, but there's a difference between abandoning someone and refusing to abandon yourself for them. We are conditioned to think that closure is something we owe to others, like a final act of emotional generosity. But the truth is, closure isn't always honest. Sometimes, when you explain yourself, you're not really speaking from clarity. You're speaking from guilt, from pressure, from the fear of being misunderstood. And in doing so, you dilute your own experience. You shape your truth into something more digestible for someone else's comfort. That's not kindness. That's self-betrayal. And becoming who you are means you must sometimes choose the path of restraint, especially when emotion demands action. When your silence isn't a weapon, but a decision not to dishonor what you've learned. Because emotional detachment isn't about indifference, It's about mastery. It's choosing not to be dragged by every wave that rises inside of you. It's realizing that peace is not the absence of emotion. It's the refusal to be ruled by it. You see, emotions are real, but they're not always reliable. They arrive like weather, intense, unpredictable, often misunderstood. But just because you feel something doesn't mean you need to act on it. The Stoics understood this well. They practiced the art of pausing, of observing, of holding back, not to suppress but to see clearly. When you detach emotionally, you don't turn numb, you become precise. And that precision allows you to say, "This doesn't deserve my explanation," because not every story needs to be retold. Not every pain needs to be validated. Some things are better left as they are, unfinished, unspoken, unchained. There's a strange dignity in silence. It doesn't seek approval. It doesn't beg to be understood. It simply holds its ground. That's why it's so unsettling to others, because we live in a world that believes louder is stronger. But the Stoic knows better. Stillness isn't weakness. It's strength without the noise. And sometimes, when you withhold your response, you're not withholding love. You're protecting it. You're refusing to give away something sacred just because someone else can't sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Silence in this way becomes a boundary, not a punishment, but a declaration. I will not explain myself just because you're uncomfortable with not knowing. I will not abandon the clarity I worked so hard to build just to help you feel a little better about losing access to me. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. That is self-respect. And this doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you've learned to feel without drowning, to observe without reacting, to care without attaching your worth to the outcome. This is what separates the emotionally entangled from the emotionally aware. One is ruled by what they can't control. The other lives by the principle that power comes from restraint, from knowing that silence isn't emptiness. It's a presence too full to be reduced to words. The more you grow, the more you'll realize how rare peace is, and how expensive it becomes to explain yourself to people who only want to argue with your silence, not understand it. There's a point in your journey where you must ask, am I speaking to connect or to be accepted? And if the answer leans toward validation, the Stoic inside you knows to step back. Not as an act of pride, but as an act of protection. For you cannot teach someone who is only listening for permission to stay the same. Emotional detachment is not a wall, it's a filter. It doesn't shut people out. It lets clarity in. It allows you to say, this is not mine to fix. This is not mine to explain. This is not mine to carry. And in that release, you find yourself again. Not diluted by their expectations, not buried under their confusion, but standing in quiet conviction, still, clear, untouched by the chaos you chose not to engage. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." And bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes bravery is staying silent when everything inside you wants to shout. It's resisting the temptation to clarify your worth. It's recognizing that walking away without a word isn't abandonment, it's alignment with your values, with your growth, with the version of yourself that no longer needs to be explained in order to be valid. You don't owe people your emotional availability just because they knock on your door with questions. You don't have to keep bleeding out your truth to those who only ever used it as a mirror for their denial. And you certainly don't have to break your own peace just to give someone else a sense of closure they should have created for themselves long ago. A Stoic sees this clearly. They understand that not all conflicts need to be resolved through dialogue. Some are resolved through distance, through silence, through letting go of the need to be understood. That's the secret. When you no longer need others to get it, you're free. Because their understanding isn't what heals you. Your own alignment is. So when someone tells you, "Just be honest with me," ask yourself, do they want the truth or do they want comfort? Because if it's the latter, then silence may be the most honest answer you can give. Not out of malice, but out of mercy. Mercy for yourself, for your energy, for your right to evolve without dragging your past into every room you enter. There's a maturity in not reacting, in watching a storm pass without getting caught in it, in recognizing that sometimes your silence is the deepest form of wisdom you can offer, because it takes strength to speak. But it takes even more strength to know when not to. And when you stop explaining, you begin transforming. You move from needing to be heard to knowing you were whole all along. You stop convincing, you start conserving, and in that conservation of energy, you find a new kind of power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that endures. In the end, a Stoic doesn't walk away to hurt others. They walk away to preserve themselves. They understand that every unnecessary explanation is a thread tied to the past. And the more you untangle, the more you realize you were never obligated to stitch someone else's understanding of you together. You were only ever meant to walk forward, with or without applause, with or without closure. So let your silence be your clarity, let your stillness be your message, and let your peace speak louder than your explanations ever could. That is the Stoic way, and it's not about being distant, it's about being free. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood, and some endings are more powerful when left unfinished. If your silence protects your peace, let it echo louder than words ever could. Watch one of the videos on your screen to continue your journey, and thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.